Nobody noticed the signal at first. That was the part that would be written about for decades afterward. The sheer mundanity of how it began. Not with an alarm, not with a military alert, not with anything that sounded the way civilization-altering events were supposed to sound. It began with a routine anomaly flag in the automated monitoring queue of the Deep Space Infrastructure Division, which was about as exciting as a government department could be named, and which employed 26 people in a low-ceilinged office building in Colorado Springs that smelled faintly of burned coffee and institutional carpet. The anomaly flag landed in the queue at 4:47 a.m. on a Thursday. It was labeled Legacy System Carrier Wave, Origin Unknown, Classification, Automated Infrastructure Ping. It was, in the language of infrastructure monitoring, the equivalent of a smoke detector in an abandoned building suddenly chirping to say its battery was fine. Technically noteworthy, practically irrelevant. The automated system had flagged it because the carrier wave matched no current infrastructure signature in the active registry, which meant it was either a sensor glitch, a decommissioned installation that hadn't been properly removed from the monitoring sweep, or very rarely, a genuine unknown. Technician First Class Danny Vasquez, 27 from San Antonio on the night shift, 3 hours from the end of a 9-hour stretch that had produced exactly nothing interesting, opened the flag and ran the standard trace protocol. The trace came back in 40 seconds. The carrier wave was originating from 23 separate locations simultaneously, not 23 sensor glitches. 23 distinct points, spread across a sphere approximately 800,000 kilometers in diameter, centered on Earth. Vasquez ran the trace again. Same result. He pulled up the infrastructure map and tried to cross-reference the 23 origin points against known installations. Current, decommissioned, planned, cancelled, experimental. The cross-reference returned 0 matches. There was nothing at those locations. No satellites, no relay stations, no buoys, no debris with active systems, no natural bodies large enough to generate a signal of this frequency. Nothing was there, but something was transmitting. Vasquez did something that he later admitted he had never done before in 3 years of night shifts. He escalated manually, instead of letting the automated queue handle it. He flagged the anomaly as Priority 1, a designation that, in the history of his department, had been used exactly 4 times, and sent it directly to his division chief, Dr. Margaret Holloway, with a note that said simply, "I don't know what this is." Dr. Holloway was in her office at 5:15 a.m. She looked at the data for 11 minutes without speaking. Then she made a phone call that went up the chain so fast that by 6 a.m., the file was sitting on the desk of the Director of National Intelligence. And by 6:40 a.m. it had been hand-delivered, physically printed, because the decision had been made not to transmit it digitally, to Admiral Sarah Chen. Chen was in her office at Space Force Command Headquarters when the courier arrived. She was reading a threat assessment on the Thar Empire, a vast, multi-system civilization that humanity had been watching nervously for 8 years, ever since their expansion frontier had crossed within 40 light-years of Seoul. The Thar Empire had consumed 6 civilizations in the past century, not defeated them, consumed them, absorbed their populations, repurposed their infrastructure, erased their cultural records. The species that had been absorbed were not destroyed. They simply ceased to exist as themselves. The Thar Empire had been aware of Earth for approximately 3 years, according to the best intelligence assessment. In that 3-year window, they had moved from awareness to interest, to what the intelligence community now classified as active acquisition planning. The working estimate was that a Thar Imperial fleet would arrive in the solar system within 18 months. Chen set down the threat assessment and opened the courier package. She read the signal data. She read Vasquez's trace results. She looked at the 23 origin points on the map. The sphere, 800,000 kilometers in diameter, centered on Earth. She picked up the phone and called the one person she had been meaning to call for 6 months, ever since a footnote in an obscure historical technical archive had caught her attention during a late-night research session, and she had written a name on a sticky note and put it on her monitor, and then gotten busy and hadn't gotten around to it. The name on the sticky note was Dr. James Alcott. Dr. Alcott was 71 years old, retired, living in Flagstaff, Arizona, and was the foremost living expert on Earth's earliest deep space infrastructure programs. The programs from the 2040s and 2050s, before the current generation of space technology, when humanity had made its first tentative reaches into the solar system with technology that was primitive by modern standards, and ambition that was, in retrospect, extraordinary. He answered on the second ring. "I've been waiting for this call," he said. No greeting, no identification, just those 6 words, as if he'd known for 20 years that someday someone would call him about this. Chen held the phone. "Dr. Alcott," she said, "tell me about the Aegis program." She heard him take a long breath. "You'd better come to Flagstaff," he said, "and bring someone who can process classified materials because what I'm going to show you has been sitting in a box in my garage since 1987, and it's going to change everything you think you know about what's been watching over this planet." The box in Dr. Alcott's garage was not dramatic. That was the first thing Chen noticed when she arrived in Flagstaff 16 hours after the phone call, with a 2-person classification team and a deputy from the director's office, who was there mostly to make sure nothing left the state without proper documentation. The box was a standard banker's box, slightly water-damaged at the bottom corner, labeled in faded marker, Aegis, Personal Archive, Do Not Discard. The box contained, among other things, 12 spiral notebooks, a collection of technical drawings on yellowed paper, 3 reels of magnetic tape that would require specialized equipment to read, and a single sealed envelope marked, "For when it wakes up." Alcott made coffee. He had clearly been awake for most of the night, and his kitchen showed evidence of a person who had spent the hours since Chen's call pulling things out of storage, and sat down across from her at his kitchen table and began to talk. The Aegis program, he said, had been the most classified project in American history. More classified than the Manhattan Project, because the Manhattan Project had eventually been acknowledged. Aegis never was. It was funded through budget lines so deeply buried in the defense appropriations that the people who approved the funding didn't know what they were approving. It was staffed by 18 people, all of whom signed agreements that went significantly beyond standard national security clearances. Alcott had been 26 when he joined the program and had been its chief architect for 9 years. "What was the program?" Chen asked. "Defense," Alcott said simply. The people who ran it, and I'll be honest, I never knew who was really at the top of the chain, had become convinced by the late 1970s that Earth was not alone in the galaxy. Not in the abstract philosophical sense. In the specific, evidential, we have intercepted signal sense. He wrapped his hands around his coffee mug. They couldn't prove it publicly. The evidence was ambiguous enough that it would have been destroyed in peer review. But they believed it. And they believed that if we were not alone, the odds were significant that some of our neighbors were not friendly. So they built a defense grid, Chen said. They built the first defense grid, Alcott said. In the 1980s and 90s, using technology that we had to invent as we went, because nothing existed for what we were trying to do. 23 installation nodes positioned in a sphere around Earth at approximately 800,000 kilometers. Each node was a combined sensor array and weapons platform. Passive detection system, long range, tuned to the frequencies that the intercepted signals suggested were standard for advanced propulsion systems. He paused. And an active weapons component. "What kind of weapons?" Chen said. Alcott looked at her for a moment. "When we built the Aegis grid," he said, "we didn't have directed energy weapons. We didn't have kinetic systems of any meaningful scale. What we had was an understanding of physics that most people didn't have access to yet, and a lot of time, and a budget that had essentially no ceiling." He set down his coffee. "We built gravity weapons." Chen looked at him. "Gravitational disruption emitters," Alcott said. "The physics was theoretical when we started. We spent 7 years making it practical. Each node generates a localized gravitational shear field, a zone where the gravitational gradient becomes steep enough, fast enough, that any object inside it experiences tidal forces that exceed the structural tolerance of any manufactured object we were aware of. It doesn't discriminate between hull materials or shielding types. If the physics of the universe applies to you and it applies to everything, the shear field tears you apart. He opened one of the spiral notebooks and slid it across the table. Range? Chen asked, already reading. Per node, approximately 50,000 kilometers effective radius. But the grid is designed to operate in concert. The 23 nodes create overlapping fields that, when activated simultaneously and coordinated, produce a coherent effect across the entire sphere. An object inside the 800,000 kilometer perimeter, when the full grid activates, doesn't encounter a single field. It encounters a cascading series of fields from all 23 nodes simultaneously. He tapped the notebook. The math is on page 47. The effect is not additive. It's exponential. A ship inside the sphere, when the grid activates at full power. He stopped. Doesn't leave, Chen finished. There is no hull material, no known shielding, no physical countermeasure that protects against a coordinated gravitational shear event of this magnitude, Alcott said. We designed it that way deliberately. We wanted a system that couldn't be defeated by something we hadn't anticipated. Gravity is gravity. It doesn't care what you've built. Chen looked at the technical drawings, the node designs, the field geometry, the activation sequence. Why did it go dormant? She asked. The program was shut down in 1994, Alcott said. Political change, budget pressure, the end of the Cold War. There was a moment where the classified intelligence community decided the existential threat had been overstated, and the program was quietly defunded. The nodes were put into low-power dormancy mode. The documentation was archived to the point of practical inaccessibility. The people who built it, he gestured at himself, were retired or reassigned with agreements that made discussion impossible. He looked at his coffee, and then everyone forgot. Not all at once, gradually. The people who knew died or aged out of relevance. The files went deeper and deeper into the archive. By 2010, I don't think there were more than 4 people still alive who knew the grid existed. Why is it waking up now? Chen asked. Alcott reached across the table and picked up the sealed envelope. For when it wakes up. Because we programmed it to, he said. The dormancy protocol included a detection trigger. If the passive sensor arrays, which have been running on minimal power for 30 years, registered a signature consistent with advanced propulsion systems within a specific proximity threshold, the system was designed to begin a wake-up sequence. He handed her the envelope. That's what Vasquez saw at 4:47 a.m. The grid didn't wake up randomly. It woke up because something triggered its detection threshold. He met her eyes. Something with advanced propulsion just entered the outer solar system. The grid saw it before we did. Chen held the envelope. She already knew what was inside it. Not the specific words, but the shape of it. Instructions. From people who had been dead for decades. Left for the person who would eventually be sitting in this kitchen holding this envelope. She opened it. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten, dated 1994. The handwriting was precise and careful. The last paragraph read, "If you are reading this, the grid has done what we built it to do. It has seen something coming that we could not wait for. The activation codes are in the blue notebook, page 112. The full power sequence takes 11 minutes from initiation to complete grid activation. We do not know what is coming. We could not know. But we built it to be ready for anything. We hope you will not need it. We suspect you will. Godspeed, Admiral." And yes, we assumed it would be an admiral. It was always going to be an admiral. Chen read the last line twice. She looked at Alcott. "What did they know that they didn't put in writing?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "That the grid isn't just a weapon," he said. "It's a message. A message written in physics. In the language that every spacefaring civilization has to speak to get anywhere." He looked out the kitchen window at the Arizona sky. Whatever comes to this solar system expecting an easy conquest is going to learn something about the people who live here. We built that lesson into the laws of the universe themselves, and we waited 60 years for the opportunity to deliver it. The Thar Imperial Acquisition Fleet entered the solar system 11 days after the Aegis grid began its wake-up sequence. It was not the largest fleet the Thar Empire had ever deployed. The absorption of civilization Keth-4, a seven-system polity that had resisted acquisition for 18 months before its final collapse, had required a fleet of over 3,000 ships. The fleet dispatched to Earth numbered 340. The Imperial Acquisition Directorate had classified Earth as a Category 3 acquisition. Significant biological and cultural assets, modest military capability, expected resistance duration of 4 to 8 weeks before capitulation, 340 ships. The fleet was commanded by Imperial Grand Admiral Tyrus Vell, not his birth name, but the title name that Thar naval tradition assigned to Grand Admirals, incorporating the prefix of his family line into the military designation. He was a being of considerable experience, 42 successful acquisitions, 0 failed operations, 60 years of service to the Thar Imperial Expansion Directorate. He had absorbed civilizations larger than humanity and civilizations smaller. He had encountered resistance ranging from negligible to fierce. He had never in 60 years failed to complete an acquisition. He looked at the data on Earth with the professional assessment of someone who had done this many times. Category 3, 4 to 8 weeks, standard protocol. The Thar acquisition protocol was not, as many civilizations assumed, primarily military. It was administrative. The military component, the fleet, was there to ensure that resistance was impossible, not to fight an extended campaign. The fleet would establish total orbital dominance, demonstrate its capability with a single overwhelming strike on military infrastructure, and then the acquisition teams would move in to begin the administrative process. Population census, resource assessment, cultural archive, infrastructure integration. The people of Earth would continue to exist. They would continue to live on their planet. They would simply no longer govern themselves or control their resources or have any meaningful agency over their own future. The Thar did not consider this cruel. They considered it efficient. Admiral Chen was in the Mars Command Center when the Thar fleet's approach was confirmed. 11 days had given her a great deal of time, and she had used every hour of it. The Aegis Grid's wake-up sequence had completed on day 4. The 23 nodes had been dormant for 3 decades, running on solar collection backup power, and their systems needed careful diagnostic cycling before Chen would trust them. She had brought in 3 teams. Alcott's original technical documentation, translated and processed by Dr. Emily Park, Space Force's top systems engineer, 36, from Seattle, into modern operational protocols. A physics team from DARPA that had spent 4 days independently verifying Alcott's gravitational shear mathematics and had come back with the specific expression of people who had been shown something that rewrote their understanding of what was possible. And a grid operations team of 21 specialists who had been living at the Mars facility while they learned to operate hardware that was 30 years old and more sophisticated than anything else humanity had built. On day 7, Chen had run the first live test. Not full power. 1 node at 2% output, targeted at a decommissioned satellite that had been positioned at the appropriate range. The satellite had ceased to exist in approximately 0.4 seconds. Not exploded, not destroyed in a conventional sense. The gravitational shear field had induced tidal forces across the satellite's structure that exceeded the tensile strength of every material it contained simultaneously. It had come apart at the molecular level, the debris field dispersing into a cloud of particles so fine they were detectable only as a slight increase in the local dust density. The DARPA physicist watching the feed, a man named Dr. Robert Tanner who had spent his career studying exotic gravitational phenomena and who was not easily impressed, had said very quietly, Oh, that's not good for whoever's on the receiving end of that." On day 9, Chen had briefed the President and the National Security Council. The briefing had lasted 3 hours. She had shown them the Thar fleet data, the Aegis Grid specifications, the satellite test footage, and Alcott's documentation. The NSC had asked many questions. Chen had answered them. At the end of the briefing, the President had looked at her and asked the question that mattered. "Does it work on ships?" "The physics doesn't distinguish between a satellite and a ship," Chen said. "The gravitational shear field responds to mass and material structure. A ship is structurally more complex than a satellite, which means more failure points, not fewer. And if they're inside the sphere when it activates? Then they encounter 23 simultaneous overlapping shear fields in an exponential cascade, Chen said. Dr. Alcott's calculations suggest the effect would be total and complete in approximately 8 seconds. 8 seconds. The NSC was silent for a moment. Admiral, the president said, do we warn them first? Chen had thought about this for 4 days. She had written 3 different answers and discarded each of them. We give them one opportunity to reverse course, she said. One transmission, once they're inside confirmed sensor range but outside the grid perimeter. We tell them that this solar system is defended, that they should turn back, that further approach will result in engagement. She paused. We do not tell them what the defense system is or how it works. We give them a genuine choice. What they do with it is on them. The president nodded. And if they don't turn back? Chen looked at the satellite test footage, the cloud of fine particles where a machine had been. Then they don't turn back, she said. On day 11, the Thar fleet crossed the heliopause. Chen sent the transmission. The Thar Imperial Grand Admiral Tyrus Vell received it on his flagship bridge and read the translation with the patient, slightly amused expression of a being who had received similar transmissions 42 times. Every species, when it first became aware of a Thar acquisition fleet entering its system, transmitted some version of this. Stop. You cannot do this. We are defended. We will resist. The specific words varied. The meaning was always the same. And the result was always the same. He had a standing order in his operational protocol for transmissions of this type. Acknowledge receipt, transmit standard acquisition notification, continue approach. He followed the protocol. Standard acquisition notification transmitted, his communications officer confirmed. Human transmission acknowledged, continuing approach on schedule. Vell returned to his pre-approach briefing materials. He did not consider even briefly turning back. He had never turned back. In the Mars Command Center, Chen received the Thar response. She read it. She had expected it. She looked at Dr. Park, who was at the grid operations console. How long until the fleet is fully inside the perimeter? Chen asked. Park checked the approach trajectory. At current velocity, complete perimeter entry in 4 hours and 17 minutes. Chen nodded. Wake up all 23 nodes, she said. Full power diagnostic. I want every system confirmed green before the fleet is inside. Yes, Admiral. Chen looked at the display showing the Thar fleet. 340 ships moving toward Earth with the unhurried confidence of 42 successful acquisitions, of 60 years of never failing, of an empire that had never encountered a defense system built by people who were afraid of something they hadn't met yet, and had 60 years to prepare for it anyway. She thought about the letter in Alcott's envelope. We hope you will not need it. We suspect you will. Godspeed, she said quietly, to people who had been dead for 30 years. Those 4 hours and 17 minutes were the longest of Sarah Chen's career. Not because she was afraid the grid wouldn't work. Park's diagnostics had come back green across all 23 nodes, and the physics team had been through the calculations so many times that Tanner had started dreaming about gravitational shear equations. The grid would work. The mathematics were not in question. The length of those 4 hours came from something else. 340 ships. Chen was not a person who doubted decisions. She had made hard calls before, in the Belt conflict, in the Kepler engagement, in a dozen smaller crises that never made the history books. She had made calls that cost lives, and she had lived with them because she had been certain each time that the alternative was worse. She did not agonize. She assessed, she decided, she executed, and she moved forward. But this was different in a way she hadn't fully processed until the clock was running. 340 ships meant people. Not humans, not anyone who had been born on this planet or any planet humanity knew, but people. Crew. Beings who had families somewhere in the Thar Empire, who had careers and histories and reasons for being on those ships, most of whom had probably never personally decided anything about the acquisition of Earth. They were following orders. They were doing their jobs. The Grand Admiral had decided. The Expansion Directorate had decided. The individual crew of 340 warships had, in all likelihood, climbed aboard and done what they were told. Chen had given them a warning. She had given them a choice. She believed that. She had written the transmission herself, personally, and had made it as clear and unambiguous as language allowed. Turn back. This system is defended. Further approach will result in engagement. The Grand Admiral had responded with a form letter. He had not turned back. That was the choice. That was the moment where what happened next became his decision, not hers. She believed that too. She spent the 4 hours in the command center working. Not the work of waiting, not staring at displays and watching the clock, but real work. She reviewed the post-activation assessment protocols. She worked through what humanity's next 48 hours would look like, the global broadcast that would be necessary, the political conversations with every head of state who didn't yet know the grid existed, the international response to the revelation that the United States had been sitting on a planet-scale defense system for 60 years without telling anyone. That conversation was going to be genuinely unpleasant, and she had been drafting talking points for days. She called Alcott twice. He was awake both times. The first call, 2 hours before perimeter entry, was technical. A question about the cascade timing sequence that Park had flagged as worth confirming directly with the original designer. Alcott walked her through it. He was calm in the way that very old men who have been waiting for something for 60 years become calm. Not indifferent, but settled. This was the moment. It had always been going to be this moment. The waiting was over. The second call, 30 minutes before perimeter entry, was not technical. Dr. Alcott, Chen said, you built this. You deserve to know what's happening in real time. I'm going to keep this channel open. Silence on the line. Then his voice, quieter than it had been. Thank you, Admiral. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, no relation to anyone, just a common name, 34 years old, from Houston, Texas, Chen's senior operations officer, gave the approach status at T-15 minutes. Fleet is at 97% perimeter ingress. All vessels inside the sphere boundary in 14 minutes, 30 seconds. Grid status. All 23 nodes confirmed green. Activation sequence ready on your authorization. Hold on, authorization, Chen said. I want 100% ingress confirmed before we activate. Every ship inside the boundary. Understood. She watched the display. The Thar fleet. Perfect formation, tight and disciplined. The kind of formation that spoke of 60 years of successful operations and zero reason to worry about what was inside the system they were entering. Moving steadily toward Earth. On the Thar flagship, Grand Admiral Vell was reviewing the preliminary acquisition assessment for Earth's northern hemisphere. Standard procedure, infrastructure evaluation, population density mapping, resource projection. He was noting a significant concentration of agricultural infrastructure in what the translation matrix identified as the North American landmass's central region. Good soil chemistry. Useful, his sensor chief said. Admiral, we're detecting an energy signature from the local asteroid belt that doesn't match mining operations. Vell looked up. Clarify. 23 points distributed in a sphere pattern centered on the inhabited planet. They've just gone to high power output simultaneously. Energy signature is... The sensor chief paused, running the analysis. Unknown classification. No matching profile in the database. Admiral, whatever this is, it wasn't in the pre-acquisition survey data. Vell looked at the tactical display. 23 energy points, a sphere, high power, activated simultaneously. He thought about the human transmission he had received 4 hours ago. This solar system is defended. He had dismissed it as standard territorial posturing. Every species said that. But the energy readings... What's our current position relative to those 23 points? He asked. The sensor chief ran the calculation. The answer came back. Vell looked at it. For the first time in 60 years of acquisitions, he felt something he did not have a prepared response for. Not fear exactly. Something colder. The specific quality of understanding, arriving too late, that a situation is not what you believed it to be. All ships, he started. In the Mars Command Center, Webb's voice. Admiral, 100% ingress confirmed. All 340 vessels inside the perimeter. Chen had 1 second. She thought about the warning she had sent. About the choice that had been made. About 42 acquisitions and the species that no longer existed as themselves because a fleet had arrived, and an empire had decided their resources and their world were worth taking. She thought about the letter. We built that lesson into the laws of the universe themselves. Activate, she said. The activation sequence took 11 minutes. Not because the weapon needed 11 minutes to fire. The gravitational shear event itself, once the cascade reached full power, was nearly instantaneous. The 11 minutes were the charge-up sequence, the node synchronization, the cascade alignment that the 23 Aegis nodes needed to achieve before they could operate as a coherent system rather than 23 independent emitters. 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, 3 things happened. The first thing, the Thar fleet, having detected the energy signature and the sphere geometry, understood that they were inside something. The exact nature of that something was not clear to their sensor teams. The gravitational shear technology had no profile in their database because they had never encountered it, because it had never been used before on anything that could report back. But the energy readings were extreme, and they were growing, and the mathematical relationship between the 23 node positions made the sphere perimeter geometrically obvious. Grand Admiral Vell ordered emergency acceleration toward the perimeter. All 340 ships, maximum drive output, attempting to exit the sphere before whatever was building reached its conclusion. They were not going to make it. The math was Dr. Alcott's math, the math from page 47 of the Spiral Notebook, the math that the DARPA team had verified and re-verified. At the power output the nodes were reaching, the effective range of each shear field was expanding faster than any conventional drive system could cover. The perimeter was not a static wall. It was a closing net. The second thing that happened in those 11 minutes, Grand Admiral Vell sent a transmission. It arrived in the Mars Command Center 40 seconds into the activation sequence. Webb read the translation aloud. Thar Imperial Fleet to Earth Command. We are experiencing unknown energy interference. We request immediate halt to hostilities to allow for diplomatic engagement. The Thar Empire is prepared to negotiate terms of... Chen held up her hand. Webb stopped reading. She looked at the display. The fleet trying to run, the nodes at 34% charge and climbing, 6 minutes remaining. Send the following, she said. This is Admiral Sarah Chen, United Earth Navy. You were warned. You had the choice. You are now inside an active defense engagement. There are no negotiations once the engagement has begun. This is not a decision we made in the last 40 seconds. This decision was made when you crossed our perimeter after receiving our warning. I am sorry for the individuals aboard those ships who had no personal role in this decision. I am not sorry for the decision itself. She nodded at Webb. He sent it. The third thing that happened in those 11 minutes was the quietest and in some ways the most significant. Dr. Alcott, on the open channel from Flagstaff, said nothing. He listened to the readouts that Chen's team was narrating. He heard the node charge percentages climbing. He heard the fleet acceleration data showing the Thar ship's desperate attempt to exit. He heard the math being confirmed in real time. At 9 minutes into the activation sequence, when the nodes were at 82% charge and the cascade alignment was approaching final phase, he said, We always wondered if it would actually work. Not the physics we were sure of, but if it would be used, if the moment would come. His voice was very quiet. All those years, all those people on that team, they're all gone now. I'm the last one. A pause. They should have been here for this. They are here, Chen said. They built this. Alcott didn't respond. At 11 minutes and 4 seconds, the cascade reached full alignment. The 23 Aegis nodes fired. What happened inside the sphere in the 8.3 seconds that followed was documented entirely by the grid's own sensor systems. Passive arrays that continued to function during and after activation, recording everything, and was later studied by physicists who described the event in papers that were, for 2 years, classified at the highest level, and then gradually, carefully released to the scientific community in a process that took a decade. The gravitational shear cascade, operating at full power across 23 nodes in coordinated exponential overlap, induced a tidal force field across the interior of the sphere that reached, at peak, approximately 10,000 times the tidal differential that would occur at the event horizon of a stellar mass black hole. It reached this level in 0.4 seconds and sustained it for 7.9 seconds before the power output began to taper. During those 7.9 seconds, 340 Thar Imperial warships, vessels made of materials whose specifications were unknown to human engineers and were presumably advanced by any standard, experienced structural failure simultaneously, not sequentially, not in the order that the shear front reached them. Simultaneously, because the exponential cascade meant the field was effectively uniform across the entire sphere interior by the time it reached lethal intensity. The sensor record showed the fleet on one reading. The sensor record showed nothing on the next reading, 0.3 seconds later. Not wreckage, not debris clouds, not the expanding sphere of fragments that a conventional explosion would produce. The gravitational shear field did not create debris. The forces involved were sufficiently extreme that the materials making up the ships were reduced, across the board, to particles smaller than the sensor system's minimum detection threshold. Dust. Less than dust. Atomic and subatomic dispersal across the interior of the sphere. 340 ships. Gone. Without a trace. Chen sat in the command center and looked at the cleared sensor display. The display that had shown 340 contacts and now showed nothing. For a very long time. Webb was silent. The entire room was silent. The only sound was the background hum of the facility's air systems and, from the open channel to Flagstaff, the sound of a 71-year-old man breathing. Then Dr. Tanner, the DARPA physicist, said from his station at the back of the room, in the voice of a man confronting something he had calculated but not truly believed until this moment. The math was right. The math was always right, Alcott said, from Flagstaff. Chen looked at the empty display for another moment. Then she turned to Webb. Status of the grid? She asked. All 23 nodes at full function, Webb said. Post-activation diagnostics running. Power draw returning to baseline. He paused. The grid is ready to fire again. Good, Chen said. Keep it ready. She stood up. She walked to the window, the small, reinforced viewport in the command center wall that looked out into the tunnel system of the Mars facility, which was not a view of anything dramatic. But she needed a moment that wasn't a screen. She thought about 42 civilizations that no longer existed as themselves because a fleet had come, and hadn't turned back, and there had been nothing to stop it. 43 would have been Earth. It wasn't. She went back to her desk. The Thar Empire did not immediately understand what had happened. That was the remarkable part. The fleet had entered the solar system on a standard acquisition approach. The fleet had gone silent. No distress signals. There had been no time for distress signals. No emergency beacons. No last transmissions beyond the Grand Admiral's negotiation request, which had been sent and had received a reply that was on record. And then nothing. 340 ships. Silent. The Empire sent a scout vessel 6 weeks later. A single small ship, equipped with the best long-range sensors available, instructed to approach the solar system and assess what had happened to the acquisition fleet. The scout vessel detected the Aegis grid within 30 minutes of entering the outer solar system. At that range, with the nodes at full operational power, the energy signature was impossible to miss. It also detected, at the coordinates where the acquisition fleet's last telemetry had placed them, an extremely fine particle dispersal that its sensors classified as possible debris field, particle size below standard detection minimum, assessment, unknown event. The scout vessel also received a transmission. Chen had written it herself over 3 days, with the same care she had given the original warning. It was not a threat. It was not a boast. It was a statement of fact, addressed to whoever received it, in the interstellar common language that the Thar Empire's own communications infrastructure used. To the Thar Empire. You sent a fleet to this solar system for the purpose of acquisition. They were warned. They continued. They encountered the defensive system protecting this solar system, and they did not survive it. This system is the home of humanity. We have lived here for 200,000 years. We did not choose to be in the path of your expansion. We did not attack you first. We did not seek this conflict. We defended our home with the tools we built for exactly this purpose, and we will continue to do so with every fleet you send, for as long as you send them. We are not asking for peace. We are informing you that conquest of this system is not possible. What you do with that information is your decision. The scout vessel transmitted the message back to the Empire and departed without incident. The Thar Empire's response took 3 months. It was not another fleet. It was a diplomatic vessel. The first diplomatic vessel the Thar Empire had sent to any civilization in its expansion history. The Empire had never needed diplomacy before. Diplomacy implied an entity that could not simply be acquired. For 300 years, the Empire had not encountered such an entity. The diplomatic vessel carried credentials, a translation team, and, most significantly, the personal representative of the Thar High Directorate, a being of senior rank, whose title translated as something close to the one who speaks when the Empire has decided to listen. The Thar had never listened before. The diplomatic talks lasted 8 months. They were not simple. The Thar did not apologize. That was not in their cultural framework, and Chen had not expected it. What they did do, through painstaking negotiation, was acknowledge, formally and in binding treaty language, that the Sol system was outside the boundary of the Thar expansion zone. Permanently, not contingent on continued military capability. Permanently, as a fixed boundary. In exchange, humanity shared nothing about the Aegis grid's design or specifications. That had been Chen's absolute condition, the one she had never moved on during 8 months of talks. The grid's technology was not on the table, not for any concession, not for any treaty language, not for anything. Why? The Thar representative had asked during their last session. The technology is clearly defensive. Sharing it would demonstrate good faith. Chen had looked at him for a moment. Because the people who built it, she said, spent 60 years afraid that something would come here and we'd have nothing to stop it. They were right to be afraid. They built the right answer. She paused. The grid is ours. It stays ours. What you do with the knowledge that it exists is up to you. The treaty was signed. Humanity threw a very large party. Chen attended for exactly 40 minutes, shook approximately 200 hands, and then excused herself and drove to the airport and flew to Flagstaff and knocked on Alcott's door. He opened it before she could knock a second time, as if he'd been waiting. He had 2 glasses of whiskey on the kitchen table. She sat down. She took the glass. She looked at the banker's box, still on the counter where it had been the first day, slightly less water-damaged looking now that it had been opened and handled. They want to put your name in the treaty, she said. You and your team. Official recognition. Alcott was quiet for a moment. What did you tell them? He asked. I told them it was your decision, she said. He looked at the box, at 60 years of work and worry and waiting. The team, he said. Not just me. All of them. Every name. If it goes in the treaty, all 18 of them go in. Done, Chen said. They sat quietly for a moment. You know what I keep thinking about? Alcott said. Not the grid, not the Empire, the scout vessel. He turned his glass slowly in his hands. When they came back and looked at where the fleet had been, no wreckage, nothing. Just gone. They have no idea what happened. They know the outcome, they don't know the mechanism. He looked at her. That's its own kind of deterrence. Chen thought about that. The unknown is scarier than the known, she said. Every time, he said. That's why we put that line in the documentation back in '94. We didn't call it a defense grid in the internal papers. We called it by the name we gave it the first day. Chen looked at him. What did you call it? She asked. He smiled. It was the smile of a 26-year-old engineer seeing his work finally, 60 years later, do exactly what he had built it to do. The unanswered question, he said. Chen raised her glass. To the people who asked it, she said. They drank. The Valdris Imperium had conquered 412 worlds, not metaphorically, not diplomatically. 412 civilizations had looked up at their skies, seen the shadow of the Imperial Armada blotting out their suns, and within a standard galactic cycle, submitted, surrendered, or ceased to exist entirely. The math was simple. The Valdris didn't negotiate, they calculated. They had war models older than most species' written languages. They had predictive algorithms that could simulate the military response of any civilization within a margin of error so small it was essentially zero. They fed a species' biology, population density, resource output, territorial instinct, and technological threshold into the Dominion engine. And it told them exactly how long the war would take, how many casualties they would absorb, and what the optimal extraction rate of the conquered world would be post-pacification. In 412 conquests, the Dominion engine had never been wrong, not once. So when the Valdris turned their expansion vector toward a small, oxygen-rich world in a minor spiral arm, a world the locals called Earth, Supreme Executor Valdorn fed the data into the engine with the casual indifference of a man signing paperwork. The humans were young, barely 6,000 years of recorded civilization. Their fastest ships couldn't break past the edge of their own solar system with any reliable consistency. Their weapons were kinetic-based, chemically propelled, laughably primitive by imperial standards. They had no unified planetary government. They were still fractured into hundreds of squabbling nation-states. The engine processed, calculated, rendered. Projected pacification timeline, 14 standard cycles. Projected imperial casualties, 0.003% of deployed force. Recommended force deployment, 2 Dominion battle groups. Confidence interval, 99.97%. Valdorn had barely glanced at the readout. 14 cycles, practically a training exercise. He assigned it to Tactical Commander Sarathol, a young, ambitious officer who needed a simple conquest to pad his service record before being assigned to the real campaigns on the Outer Rim. The kind of mission where a commander could look competent without breaking a sweat. 2 battle groups, 47 warships, 90,000 Valdris assault troops, against one small, divided, primitive world. It should have been over before it started. The first signal came in on Cycle 3. Sarath-ul was reviewing extraction projections for the human northern continent when his communication officer, a pale-crested Valdris named Orveth, went unusually quiet at his station. Commander. Sarath-ul didn't look up. Report. The ground teams in Sector Ven have stopped transmitting. He looked up then. All of them? Yes, Commander. All 43 ground teams in Sector Ven simultaneously. Sarath-ul set down his data slate very slowly. 43 teams didn't go silent simultaneously from equipment failure. Last known transmission? Orveth's crest flattened, the Valdris equivalent of a deep frown. They were reporting routine pacification operations. Local resistance had been minimal. Then, he paused, his voice dropping half a register. Then one of them transmitted a single phrase before the signal cut. What phrase? Orveth looked at his commander with the expression of someone who very badly did not want to say the next words out loud. They're not running. The command bridge went very, very quiet. In 412 conquests, the Valdris ground forces had a universal experience. Every species, every civilization, every culture, when confronted with imperial assault troops, their technology, their numbers, their absolute ferocity, ran. It was not cowardice. It was biology. Every sentient species in the known galaxy had a survival mechanism that recognized an overwhelming predator and screamed escape. Every species had that mechanism. Sarath-ul stood up slowly from his command chair. Get me visual on Sector Ven. That's the other problem, Commander. Orveth's voice was barely above a whisper now. The orbital observation platforms over Sector Ven are also offline. Offline. Destroyed, sir. Something came up from the surface and destroyed them. But our sensors can't identify the launch signature. It doesn't match any human weapon system in our database. Sarath-ul stared at him. Any weapon system? Any system we have on record, Commander. Whatever took out those platforms, and we don't know what it is. The supreme commander of two Valdris battle groups stood on the bridge of the most powerful warship in the sector and felt, for the first time in his decorated career, something cold move through his chest. He pulled up the intelligence dossier on Earth again. Read it from the beginning this time, not skimming. Reading. His eyes stopped on a passage he had ignored the first time, a cultural note filed by a xenosociologist in the pre-invasion assessment team. The kind of soft science commentary that tactical commanders routinely dismissed. Note of interest. Humans are the only species in our survey catalog that has, at various points in their history, deliberately trained specific members of their population not to suppress their violent threat response, but to amplify it. They have cultural institutions, spanning thousands of years, dedicated to producing individuals in whom the survival flight instinct has been systematically inverted. These individuals do not run from danger. They have been conditioned, through processes that vary by culture and era, but share remarkable functional consistency, to move toward it. Furthermore, and this analyst considers this the most significant finding in the entire assessment, the humans do not consider this unusual. They celebrate it. They name these individuals, construct mythology around them, grant them status and resources. In every other species surveyed, such individuals would be classified as neurologically aberrant. Among humans, they are the ones placed in charge of defense. Recommendation: adjust confidence interval. This variable has not been adequately weighted. Sirath Ul read it twice. Then he opened a direct channel to Supreme Executor Vile Dorn. "Sir," he said, "I think we may have made an error." 3 weeks before the Valdris fleet entered Earth's solar system, a man named Marcus Hale was sitting in a classified briefing room somewhere beneath a mountain range that doesn't appear on any publicly available map. He was 38 years old. He had no social media presence, no public records past the age of 19, and 3 passports, all in different names. His file, had anyone outside the room been cleared to read it, contained a psychological evaluation that used the word anomalous 14 times in 11 pages. Across the table from him sat 11 other people. They did not look like soldiers. That was the first thing anyone who stumbled into that room by accident would have noticed. Soldiers have a particular kind of stillness, a discipline, a rigidity, a posture that speaks of hierarchy, absorbed into bone. The people in this room had stillness too, but it was a different kind entirely. The stillness of something that has stopped pretending. Their names in the official documentation were listed as unit designation, Chimera. 12 individuals drawn from programs that officially did not exist, recruited through channels that officially had never operated, trained in facilities that officially had never been built. The woman at the head of the table was Colonel Yara Vasquez. She had no official rank because her branch of service had no official name. What she had instead was 17 years of operational history in places where conventional military presence was considered too visible, too accountable, or too human. She looked around the table at the 11 people in front of her. "The Valdris Imperium," she said, "has conquered 412 worlds. Their invasion model assumes that every civilization they encounter will respond to overwhelming force the same way, with panic, fragmentation, and eventual collapse." She paused. That model has never failed. Nobody at the table said anything. They had been briefed on the fleet in orbit, the numbers, the firepower, the casualty projections if Earth attempted a conventional military response. They had all read the numbers. None of them looked particularly concerned. That, Vasquez reflected, was precisely why they were in this room. "Every nation contributing to this operation has submitted its best," she continued. "Special operations veterans, intelligence operatives, psychological warfare specialists, people who have spent careers learning to operate in environments where the expected response is not available to them." She let that sit for a moment. "The Valdris have a war model built on pattern recognition. They've seen hundreds of species. They've cataloged every possible variation of organized resistance." She looked around the table one more time. "They have never seen us." What the Valdris had not understood, what their war model had catastrophically failed to weight, was the specific product of human history. Most civilizations, when they developed warfare, developed it as an extension of territorial instinct. They built armies, hierarchies, systems of organized force that could be mapped, predicted, countered. The Valdris had conquered armies. They were very good at it. But humans had not only built armies. Over 10,000 years of recorded conflict, a small subset of humanity had gone somewhere else entirely. Not bigger armies, not more powerful weapons. Something stranger, more dangerous, and far harder to model. Call it what the recruiting files called it. Asymmetric persistence, the capacity to continue operating, effectively, creatively, lethally, in conditions that would render conventional military units non-functional. No supply lines, no chain of command, no tactical certainty, no safe direction, no reliable intelligence, no reasonable expectation of survival. Not just tolerating those conditions, preferring them, because in chaos, pattern recognition-based war models stop working. And the people in that room had spent their entire careers learning to generate chaos. Corporal Jinsu Park had once spent 41 days alone behind enemy lines in a region without resupply, communications, or extraction possibility, and had come out the other side having completed his mission and, by his own account in the debrief, feeling clearer than he had in years. Sergeant Amara Ose had been captured twice by hostile forces. She had escaped both times, and neither facility had been functional afterwards. The psychological evaluation after the second incident had noted, with visible professional discomfort, that her stress cortisol levels during captivity had been lower than baseline. Warrant Officer Dmitry Varenkov communicated primarily through gesture and expression. When he did speak, it was in short declarative sentences. His evaluations contained phrases like, does not experience threat stimuli in a normative fashion, and recommend further study before standard deployment. He had been in Chimera for 9 years. Lieutenant Seo Yeon-kwan had a doctorate in cognitive systems from a university she had never attended, in a name she no longer used. She had also, at some point in her career, talked her way out of 3 different execution orders using 3 different languages, one of which she had learned during the 48 hours preceding each incident, respectively. These were not extraordinary people by normal metrics. By normal metrics, several of them would have required significant intervention. But on a planet being approached by an alien empire with a 99.97% confidence interval, normal metrics were the least useful thing available. The Valdris made landfall on the European continent first. It was a strategic choice. Dense population, multiple centers of political power, high visibility. The kind of landing that broke morale. Imperial doctrine called it impression strike. Overwhelming force deployed in the most psychologically significant location to trigger cascading civilian panic and governmental collapse. It worked. It always worked. The human governments fractured exactly as projected. Emergency broadcasts, competing evacuation orders, political leaders contradicting each other. The civilian population flooded transport networks. Communications went to static in the targeted zones. The Dominion engine processed the data feeds and returned a satisfied status. Pacification, proceeding within projected parameters. The first 3 Valdris assault groups moved into the city centers. 48 hours of impression strike, then a broadcast offering surrender terms, generous by imperial standards, deliberately so because a fast capitulation was more efficient than prolonged resistance. 48 hours passed. The surrender broadcast went out. Silence. Not the silence of capitulation, not the silence of communication infrastructure collapse. The comms were working fine. The Valdris were monitoring them. The silence was human governments looking at each other and apparently deciding not to answer. Sarathul found this baffling. Run the behavioral model again. Already run, sir. Confidence interval unchanged. The projection indicates a response within the next 6 standard hours. They may simply need more time to organize the formal transmission. He nodded, waited. 6 hours later, the response came. Not from a government, not from a military command structure, from the ground, from inside the controlled zones. The assault team commander in the Brussels sector filed the report with shaking hands. Metaphorically speaking, since Valdris anatomy didn't quite work that way. but the behavioral equivalent was unmistakable. His name was Subcommander Vel Arak, and he had been on 11 pacification campaigns. He was not inexperienced. What had happened in the Brussels sector had no precedent in his 11 campaigns. His forces had established a perimeter, standard grid, every road in and out monitored. The local population had been contained in the central district, an efficient arrangement, familiar from a dozen other worlds. Then, over a period of approximately 6 hours, 17 of his soldiers had simply disappeared. Not retreated from, not fled by, disappeared. No bodies, no evidence of engagement, no noise, no weapon signatures, no indication of a firefight. His men had been standing their posts, and then they had not been standing their posts, and there was nothing in between those two states that his sensors could detect. And then, and this was the part of the report that made Sarathol read it 3 times to make sure he had the translation correct. The humans had given them back. Not killed, not prisoners. Returned. Left at the perimeter. Alive. Unharmed. Except that every single one of them had been stripped of their weapons, their communications equipment, their tactical armor, and their unit identification. They had been returned in their underlayer clothing, disoriented, with no memory of the interval between disappearing and reappearing. And attached to the tunic of each returned soldier, in the Valdris written language, in characters precise enough to have been penned by someone who had studied it, was a single sentence, the same sentence, on all 17. We found your soldiers. We are returning them. Next time, we will not. Colonel Vasquez stood in a drainage tunnel beneath what had been, until 72 hours ago, an occupied city center. Around her, 11 people were doing various things with the quiet, unhurried focus of individuals who considered the current situation entirely manageable. Park was reassembling a piece of Valdris communications equipment with the practiced ease of a man who had spent the previous 4 hours learning to read alien firmware architecture. Quan was translating a Valdris tactical code book she had acquired, the report didn't specify how, in the past 18 hours. Varenkov was asleep, deliberately and without apology, because he had a 4-hour window before his next operational tasking, and he used available time efficiently. Status, Vasquez said. Osei looked up from her position near the tunnel access. Asset network is operational in all 5 sectors. Contact established with 43 local civilian nodes. Supply corridor to the northern route is open. Their orbital scan frequency. Every 4 minutes, 11 seconds. We have mapped the blind spots. They're consistent. Their scanning protocol is standardized, not adaptive. Vasquez absorbed this. Of course it is. She said it not with contempt, but with something closer to professional recognition. 412 worlds, and it's always worked. No reason to make it adaptive. This was the thing that the Dominion engine had failed to calculate. Not the firepower, not the numbers, not even the specific individuals, remarkable as they were. The orientation. The Valdris built their war model on the assumption that every species when invaded was trying to stop the invasion. The natural, logical response to an overwhelming force was to find a way to match it, overpower it, push it back. That was not what Chimera was doing. They were not trying to win a war. They were not even trying to fight one in the conventional sense. They were trying to make the war unnavigable. Every move they made was designed not to destroy Valdris forces, but to destroy Valdris certainty. To take a war model built on pattern recognition and introduce so much noise, so much contradiction, so many variables that fell outside the predicted range, that the model simply stopped producing reliable outputs. 17 soldiers returned in their underwear, alive and unharmed, told the Valdris nothing about what had happened to them. But it told them something far more destabilizing, that the enemy had decided to return them, which meant the enemy had made a choice, which meant the enemy was operating with a goal that wasn't immediately legible. An enemy you couldn't read was an enemy you couldn't model. And an enemy you couldn't model was the one thing in 412 campaigns the Valdris had never encountered. Sarath Ul called an emergency command council on Cycle 6, His senior commanders were arrayed around the tactical display, a holographic representation of the occupied zones, updated in real time with sensor data. From orbit, it looked controlled. The grid was maintained, the perimeters were holding, the civilian population was contained. But the data inside the perimeters was increasingly difficult to interpret. 17 additional soldiers missing from Sector Gamma, said his intelligence officer Subcommander Rethvalin. None recovered this time. No message, no indication of method. They were present at 0400, absent by 0600. The communications relay in Sector Delta? Destroyed. The replacement was destroyed within 40 minutes of installation. The secondary replacement was destroyed within 20 minutes. We have no communication capability in that sector. A pause. We also believe our channel encryption has been compromised, but we cannot confirm this because anything we transmit on that channel to confirm the compromise would itself be compromised. The food supply depot in Sector Vane? Rethvalin hesitated. Among the Valdris, hesitation was unusual. It indicated processing difficulty, a situation where available data was insufficient to produce a conclusion. The depot is functional, intact. However, we recommend against using it. Why? Another hesitation. Because we do not know how it remained intact. Everything around it in a 300-unit radius was damaged in the night operation. The depot itself was untouched, which is either an oversight on the part of the attackers, she paused, or it is not an oversight. Sarathol stared at the display. They left the food supply deliberately. We believe so. To make us uncertain whether it's safe. Yes. He looked at the hologram for a long time. Run a consumption risk analysis. Already done. The analysis indicates a 34% probability the depot has been compromised in some fashion. But the analysis is based on standard interference patterns, and these attackers have not been following standard patterns. Adjusting for unknown variables, the true probability range is between 12% and 71%. That's not an analysis, that's a shrug. Yes, Commander, it is. What the Valdris were experiencing had a name in human military theory. Vasquez had studied it for 20 years. It was older than any weapon system, older than any technology, as old as human conflict itself. Psychological attrition, not the destruction of an enemy's forces, the destruction of an enemy's will to continue, the systematic erosion of confidence, certainty, and the sense that the war was manageable. You couldn't fight what you couldn't find. You couldn't plan against what you couldn't predict. You couldn't maintain morale in forces that didn't know where the threat was coming from, how many there were, what they wanted, or what the rules of engagement were. The Valdris had landed 90,000 troops. Chimera had 12 people. And every single day, the Valdris war model diverged further from observed reality. On Cycle 9, a Valdris unit in the northern sector encountered something they filed as contact with hostile personnel, and then, in the same report, spent 6 paragraphs struggling to accurately describe. They had been moving through a cleared residential district. All civilians removed, all structures checked, all routes mapped. A standard patrol. They had done 100 of them since landing. They heard music, human music, a single instrument, something unfamiliar to them, melodic and unhurried, coming from inside a building they had cleared 6 hours prior. Doctrine said, investigate, suppress, report. 12 soldiers entered the building. The music stopped. 4 minutes later, 8 of the 12 came back out. The other 4 did not come out. The 8 who returned could not describe what had happened to the 4 who hadn't, not because they were being uncooperative, but because, as their debrief established beyond reasonable doubt, they genuinely did not know. They had been in the same room. The 4 had simply ceased to be present. But here was the part of the report that Sarath Ul read 4 times. The 8 who returned were, by every measurable metric, physically unharmed. But in the debrief, every one of them used the same unprompted phrase when asked to describe the experience. In 8 different soldiers, without coordination, in separate debrief sessions. They were watching us the whole time. Not we were attacked. Not they ambushed us. They were watching us the whole time, as if the entire patrol had been, from beginning to end, observed, studied. As if every Valdris soldier in that district had been walking through someone else's intelligence operation without knowing it. The psychological effect on the unit was not catalogued by any Valdris measurement system, because Valdris measurement systems did not have a category for it. What the unit had experienced, a human psychologist would have identified immediately. They had felt hunted. On Cycle 11, Sarathul did something no Valdris commander in 412 campaigns had ever done. He broadcast a request for direct communication, not surrender terms, not ultimatum. A request. He used the human linguistic databases captured in the first landing cycle, and he transmitted on every available frequency a message in 11 human languages. I wish to speak with your commanders. For 18 hours, there was no response. Then, on a frequency he hadn't transmitted on, a frequency that, according to his communications officer, his fleet was not currently monitoring, which meant whoever was transmitting it had known his scanning pattern well enough to find a gap in it. A single voice came through. Human, female, unhurried. You don't have commanders in your database for us. Sarath-ul leaned forward in his command chair. Then who am I speaking to? A pause. Not hesitation, consideration. The people your model didn't account for. I have become aware, he said carefully, that my operational projections were inaccurate. Yes. I would like to understand why. The voice was quiet for a moment. When it spoke again, there was something in its tone that he couldn't quite categorize. Not hostility, not gloating. Something more like a teacher with a student who had finally asked the right question. You built a model. 412 worlds. Every species in your catalog sent you their armies, their soldiers, people trained to fight, and also trained to stop fighting when the math stopped working, when the losses got too high, when the supplies ran out, when the chain of command fractured. Yes, Sarathul said. That is correct. We didn't send those people. He waited. Every species you've conquered has soldiers. They're the people a civilization builds to protect itself, trained to use force, but also trained to know when force isn't working, and to report that up the chain so someone can make a decision. Yes. We have those people too, we didn't send them. A pause. We sent the ones that don't report it up the chain, the ones that don't stop when the math stops working, the ones who have been specifically prepared over years for the condition you created. No supply lines, no communications, no tactical certainty, no clear chain of command. Operating inside an occupied zone against a technologically superior force. Sarath-ul said nothing. He was listening very carefully. You wanted a war. Your model told you what that would look like. You expected soldiers because every other species you've faced has sent soldiers. What you got instead was something your model has no category for. And what is that? The answer came without hesitation. People for whom this is normal. Sarathul sat with that for a long time after the channel closed. He pulled up the Dominion engine's original projection. Confidence interval, 99.97%. He looked at the assumptions embedded in that number. Every one of them logical. Every one of them drawn from a robust dataset. Every one of them assuming that the humans would respond to invasion the way every other species had. The Dominion engine didn't have a failure mode for an enemy that welcomed the conditions of asymmetric occupation. It had no category for combatants whose training was specifically designed for the exact scenario the Valdris had created. A populated zone, denied to conventional forces, with degraded communications and no clear front line. Because no species had ever sent those people. No species had ever had those people, or if they had recognized what they were, and put them specifically in charge of this. He opened a direct channel to Supreme Executor Vale Dorn. Sir. Report, Commander. Sir, I recommend immediate revision of the Dominion engine's assessment parameters for the human species. A pause. The engine shows pacification at 61% completion. The engine's data inputs are compromised, sir. We believe our communications have been monitored since Cycle 4. The 61% figure is based on controlled zone telemetry that may have been deliberately manipulated. A longer pause. Manipulated by whom? Their governments collapsed in Cycle 2. There is no command structure. That is correct, sir. There is no command structure. He paused. I believe that is the point. Part 5. The Reckoning, minutes 23 to 25. On Cycle 14, the day the Dominion engine had projected full pacification, the Valdres fleet received a transmission. Not from a government. Governments had indeed collapsed, just as projected. Not from a military command. There was no unified military command structure left on Earth, just as projected. The transmission came from one voice, on a frequency the Valdres had spent 11 days trying and failing to locate. Short, clear, in perfect standard Valdres, spoken by someone who had apparently learned the language in the past 2 weeks. You came to a world and expected to find what you've always found. You found something else. We're giving you a choice, a courtesy you didn't extend to the 412 worlds before us. Pause. Leave. Another pause, shorter. Your fleet, your forces, everything you brought. You have 72 hours. We will not interfere with your withdrawal. We will not fire on your ships. We will not pursue. And then, the sentence that made every Valdres officer who heard the transmission go very, very still. But if you are still here in 72 hours, we will stop being restrained. Sarathul looked at his command council. They looked back at him. Nobody spoke for a very long time. Because the thing that turned the transmission from a bluff into something else, something credible, something that sat in the chest like a cold stone, was everything that had happened in the previous 11 cycles. 17 soldiers returned in their underwear, alive as a message. Soldiers disappearing from cleared zones with no trace. Patrols convinced they were being watched before anything happened. A food depot left intact specifically to be uncertain about. A communications frequency found in a gap in their own scanning pattern. All of it restrained. All of it calibrated. Every action designed not to maximize casualties, but to maximize psychological effect, which meant the people behind it were entirely capable of deciding what level of force to apply, which meant restrained was a real description, which meant what came after restrained was real too. Sarathul looked at the Dominion engine's current output. It had stopped producing confidence intervals 6 cycles ago. The data was too noisy. It was returning a status it had never returned in 412 campaigns. Insufficient pattern data, unable to project. He looked at it for a long time. Then he opened the fleet-wide command channel. All units, this is Commander Sarathul. Begin withdrawal protocols. They left in 61 hours, 11 hours ahead of the deadline. Nobody discussed that detail in the debrief. It wasn't the kind of thing Valdres commanders put in reports. Back on the human side, in a tunnel beneath a city that was just beginning to understand that the ships in orbit were moving, Colonel Vasquez looked at the sensor feed on a small captured Valdres display and watched the fleet begin to pull back. Nobody in the tunnel cheered. Nobody celebrated. Park looked up from the piece of equipment he was still out of what appeared to be pure professional interest, reverse engineering. Osei tilted her head slightly, the way she did when she was recalculating something. Varenkov opened his eyes from his rest position, observed the display for exactly 3 seconds, and closed them again. Vasquez looked at the feed a moment longer, then she turned back to the room. When the last ship clears sensor range, she said, then we go home. Nobody argued with that. They waited. 3 months later, in a different part of the galaxy, Supreme Executor Vale Dorn was called before the Valdres High Command to explain the first failed pacification in the history of the Dominion. He brought the Dominion engine's final output, the sensor logs, every report from every ground commander. He laid it all out, methodically, in the precise and detailed manner of a man who had spent a long time understanding exactly what had happened and was not looking forward to explaining it. The High Command listened. When he was done, the eldest of them, a figure whose service record stretched back 100 years and spanned wars that had made the Valdres what they are, asked a single question. You're telling me we lost to 12 people? Vile Dorn considered the precise accuracy of that statement. No, sir, he said. We lost to what 12 people are. There's a difference. The elder looked at him for a long time. Update the engine, she said finally. Add a new category. What category? She looked at the planet's designation on the tactical display. The small, oxygen-rich world in a minor spiral arm. The young species. The divided civilization. The primitive weapons. Unprojectable, she said. And for the first time in the history of the Valdris Dominion, a world in their catalog was marked not as pacified, not as pending, not as contested, but as do not engage. Somewhere in a tunnel beneath a rebuilding city, a woman with no public records and 3 passports read the final intelligence report, confirming the Valdris had left the solar system entirely. She set it down. She made coffee. The war, if it had ever really been a war, was over. It had lasted 14 cycles. Just like the engine predicted, for entirely the wrong reasons.